Good evening or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome. This is another timely topic that Nikolai Pippa seems to have the magic touch. I want to welcome you, and for those of you, except those of you who are tweeting, could I ask that you please turn your cell phones off? If you're tweeting, that's fine. And I want to thank my friend Robert Kuhn. Where is Robert? Let me just walk back there. Robert was instrumental in getting this program for us, and I really appreciate it. Let me welcome Little Rock Mayor Mark Stodola. Mayor, glad to have you here. I see former North Little Rock Mayor Pat Hayes back there. You can ask Pat Hayes about him moving to Little Rock. We talk about that on a regular basis. And we're glad to have each and every one of you here, so thank you all for coming. Brigham McCown is an expert in the subject that we're getting ready to talk about today. And he's now Managing Director and Principal of United Transportation Advisors in Dallas. He served in several leadership positions in the Department of Transportation during the presidency of George W. Bush, both terms. And he was the first acting administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. In a July 15 op-ed in the Washington Times, he wrote, quote, "Pipelines remain the safest, most secure, least carbon intensive, and most efficient way to transport large volumes of energy products over great distances." Given the recent Exxon pipeline spill near Mayflower, which he has visited, and the debate over the proposed Keystone Pipeline, it is indeed very timely that he is here with us today to discuss pipelines as well as other transportation and infrastructure matters. Please welcome Brigham McCown.
Wow, it's a full house. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you, Dean Rutherford, for your very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today at the Clinton School of Public Service, here at the University of Arkansas, and immediately adjacent to the beautiful Clinton Library, which I've just had the pleasure of revisiting. And Mayor Stodola, where are you, sir? Thank you for coming out. And I'd also like to thank the school for the kind invitation to be with you all here today. Let me start by saying that I think the Clinton School provides a vital role to Arkansas and to the nation by preparing future leaders with the education and the training that they will need to successfully navigate the challenges and opportunities of not only today, but tomorrow. I'm truly honored to be a small part of that dialogue and discussion. And although I grew up in Southern Ohio, my family was heavily involved in public service, and I was lucky enough to first travel to Arkansas and to here in Little Rock over 30 years ago. I recall standing in the governor's office, the attorney general's office, and in amazement as a child. And I still have my Arkansas Traveler and my honorary assistant attorney general certificate that hung in my room as a teenager. I referred earlier to that wonderful library and what a testament it is to the Clinton administration and how well it captures the imagination and the excitement of that period. It was also good to see pictures of many of my friends in that library. And, although I know I was a lot younger back then, I saw a picture of Steve Clark, who many of you may know is a dear family friend of ours, and let me tell you, he really looked a lot younger back then, too. Speaking of those folks, I also recall a fine June day spent riding in the Pink Tomato Festival down in Warren Parade, where the politicians sat on the hood of the car, and it got really hot from what I remember, and waved, and I sat in the back and waved to people. I had no idea who they were, but I was in the parade. And so it's good to be back here in Arkansas today, and I also have a relative buried down in Magnolia as well. So it's truly terrific to be back here among what I believe are friends. And so I'd like to begin speaking about a couple of things that are beyond controversy before we talk about the controversy. And then I'd like to spend some of our time here together discussing areas that, have proven quite controversial, and maybe offer some perspectives as a former federal regulator. A lot has been said and written about our nation's pipeline infrastructure footprint in the last several years, much of it owing to the fact of the Keystone XL proposal has been the focal point of so much intense debate, particularly in Washington. And I've heard here that in Arkansas, people are also talking a little bit about pipelines these days as well. So, as a nation, I think our conversation must recognize, as Dean pointed out, thank you for that plug for my op-ed, sir, of the importance that energy does play in our daily lives. Energy is a necessity, not a luxury. And that said, any discussion about how we balance production and the transportation of these energy resources which make modern day life possible must be balanced against the necessary safeguards for our environment and our communities. And all of this must be grounded in fact. Sound engineering and science should never take a back seat to politics or hyperbole. So in nearly 2003, a well-respected Democrat by the name of Norman Mineta asked if I would come to Washington, D.C. to work at the Transportation Department under President Bush. At first, I thought he was confused. But then I realized, for those of you who know, that he was also President Clinton's Secretary of Commerce before that. And for those who met Secretary Mineta, you know that he's one of the greatest statesmen, I believe, of our time, having endured certain injustices during World War II as a child, as a Japanese American, having risen to become the first Japanese American mayor of San Jose, leading member of Congress, and the chairman of the Public Works Committee, which is now the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And then later to become not only the Secretary of Commerce, but the longest-serving Secretary of Transportation. So if you haven't met him, please take my word for it. And I mentioned to the Dean that he's the guy that should be standing up here maybe on one of your near-future lectures. So I mentioned that because I saw Secretary Mineta's chair in the cabinet room next door, and I remember that he was fond of saying that safety is not a partisan issue. It's a shared responsibility for all of us. And that sentiment is fundamental, I believe, to the DNA that runs throughout the Transportation Department when it comes to transportation safety. So I was fortunate enough to serve as the first head of a federal agency which, before a few months ago, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA for short. I hear it referred to as PHMSA, but trust me, it's actually PHMSA. PHMSA is responsible for the safe and secure movement of over 1 million, think about that for a second, daily shipments of hazardous materials throughout the United States. And so whether it comes by rail, truck, barge, vessel, or aircraft, or yes, pipeline, PHMSA is responsible for enforcing the nation's hazardous materials laws and regulations. It is also responsible for harmonizing those regulations around the world for imports and exports, known as the dangerous goods laws. As a part of its mission, PHMSA is responsible for overseeing 2.6 million miles of pipeline. I'm going to let that figure sit for a second. 2.6 million miles. Put another way, that's enough to wrap around the earth 100 times. If you look at a map of a pipeline map, I've had people come into my office and say, "Why do you have the interstate highway map on your wall?" And I said, "No, that's not." And just like we have roads, small roads and big roads, there's an underground pipeline infrastructure network that is our underground energy highways. PHMSA works closely with its state partners to oversee this mission. And so pipelines consist of gathering, production, transmission, and distribution lines in both liquid and gaseous form. And approximately 66% of all energy products we use come from pipelines at some point. And the vast majority of that 2.6 million miles consist of natural gas distribution lines. If it heats a home in Arkansas or southern Ohio, where I came from, powers a factory, fuels an airplane, or provides fuel to a car, truck, lawnmower, you name it, it was made possible by our transportation network. When it comes to transporting hazardous materials, safety decisions have always been and must continue to be factually based. I'm pleased to report that when it comes to the agency's core mission of safety, the agency does not have any particular side or agenda. PHMSA only considers data and science. In other words, the U.S. DOT and PHMSA are about the truth, because regulatory decisions impacting our country must be impartial and factually based. I think that's important in the context of all pipelines, but also the Pegasus line and what happened in Mayflower. I can tell you, as the former pipeline regulator who served as the first head of the agency, which means I got to hire a lot of people that are still there today, they've told me this line is not going to be restarted until the federal government is fully satisfied that it's safe. And that may take a while. And before I get back into Pegasus, I want to make just a few remarks about Keystone. Let's take the Keystone XL pipeline expansion as an example. I'm curious, how many know that there is already an existing Keystone pipeline that operates today? Okay. I was recently invited to Capitol Hill to testify at a hearing on Keystone XL, and I was reminded by, depending on who was asking the questions, that the 1,100-mile Keystone XL pipeline, which would link Hardisty, Alberta, to Steel City, Nebraska, has been deliberated, debated, studied, reviewed, analyzed, reanalyzed, talked about for environmental studies for almost 5 years. In fact, today, I think, let's see if I get this right, 4 years, 11 months, 1 day, and something. North Dakota Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp pointed out that the administration has taken longer to make a decision on Keystone than it took to beat Hitler in World War II, which is pretty amazing. It's been examined for 1,795 days, give or take a couple. The Empire State Building could have been built 5 times over by now. Even the Transcontinental Railroad was built in less time. And so I do want to say one thing on the record, and that is that I do call building Keystone XL a no-brainer decision that should be done. I say that because Keystone will be one of the safest pipelines in the world, using cutting-edge technology while helping to accelerate the movement toward greater North American use of fuel. And for anybody that's been watching what's been going on in Egypt or some of the other countries, my personal opinion is we can't get there too quickly. Not everyone, of course, shares this view, and unfortunately, I think Keystone XL and pipeline infrastructure at large has become proxy to the larger debate about a national energy direction. Opponents of hydrocarbons have assumed that an aggressive posture toward all pipelines in order to further what they see as the need to end our addiction to oil and our dependency upon fossil fuels. These advocacy groups have been tremendously artful in sowing indecision, uncertainty, and even hysteria when it comes to the perceived risks of energy transportation. And as a result, it's becoming, I think, more and more difficult to have a policy discussion about pipelines, the benefits, and the risks, and about pipeline safety. The truth is that our nation requires all forms of energy. We have to have a truly all-the-above approach to energy production. The cups, the bottles we see sitting on the tables have come from oil-based products. My pen, everything that I do, these pages, and even with our way of life and our convenience that we all enjoy depend upon reasonable access to, and reliable, safe, and cost-effective solutions. Just as a skilled worker carries a toolbox with many different kinds of tools in his or her toolbox, the U.S. does require a truly all-the-above approach to energy development. I think we are standing at the precipice of an energy renaissance in America, and that only a few years ago we were told that we had no more supplies, that oil was gone, that natural gas was gone. We now know that the U.S. possesses more natural gas than Saudi Arabia possesses oil. And speaking of oil, our own reserves, thought to be dwindling just a few years ago, are far more expansive than anyone would have imagined. And as an aside, I'm not here to tell you that I'm a proponent of fossil fuels. I simply look at the data, and one of the pieces of data is that the United States government's own Energy Information Agency, the EIA, say that 3 times fast, projects that the world economy will remain largely dependent on fossil fuels during my lifetime. According to the EIA, the nonpartisan, again, it's the nonpartisan statistical agency within the Department of Energy, by 2040, renewables will only account for 10% of all electric generation worldwide. Now, that's not to say we should accept the status quo. We shouldn't. I think we can do better than that. We should encourage the development of bridge fuels and support further research and development in renewables. But the reality is, however, as sobering as it may be, that we will remain a hydrocarbon-based economy for the foreseeable future. If you accept that premise, then the question is not if the energy materials we need will get to market. The question we should all be asking is, how will they get there? And to that end, I think it's of vital importance that we as a nation ensure that these resources are delivered to their intended destinations in the most safe and efficient means possible. In order to do that, we must look at facts, lest we drown out discussions rooted in that very sound science and engineering that I spoke of earlier. So here are some of the facts. And I think even my friends on the opposition agree. First, the U.S. has developed the safest and most efficient energy transportation system in the world. And whether it's by truck, barge, pipeline, or rail, America's transportation infrastructure, and to a larger extent, North American infrastructure, is sound, efficient, and safe. The transportation system we rely on collectively boasts a 99% plus safety record. That said, there's a reason why pipelines have transported the lion's share of our energy products for over half a century. Secretary Norm Mineta has been often quoted as saying, "Our pipelines are to the economy as the arteries are to our bodies. By moving the lifeblood of our economy, pipelines are the medium by which we can go about our daily business." On a ton-mile, and there's a reason, on a ton-mile basis, pipeline transport is 530% safer than rail and 50,000 times safer than truck. Think about that for just a second. And again, the premise is that all of them are safe, but 530 times safer than rail and 50,000 times safer than truck. They're not only safer than alternative forms of transportation, they're more efficient because unlike trucks, barges, and trains, they move the product to the market without requiring a return trip. A round trip for rail cars, locomotives, or trucks is required. A pipeline like Keystone, for example, moves the equivalent of 400 rail tank cars worth of petroleum a day. That's 146,000 rail tank cars per year. Those are the facts. They are undeniable. Most people don't know that there are more than 2 million miles of pipelines in the U.S. And the reason why people don't really think about this is because pipelines are working largely the way they were designed to work, safely, reliably, and out of sight. In 2002, the exact number is 99.999952% of oil moved by pipeline was transported safely without accident. The reason for this is twofold. The first reason is that pipelines by design have inherent advantages over competing forms of transportation, which contribute to the very strong safety record. By remaining largely underground and out of sight, our pipeline safety system moves 31 million barrels of fuel each and every day. And I think that's a pretty staggering figure. The second reason is effective oversight. The pipeline safety laws are the culmination of many years of debate, studies, active deliberations, thoughtful analysis, and some yelling. Many stakeholders have contributed to this debate for one purpose: the construction of a safer, more reliable, and more secure transportation system for all Americans. Subsequent pipeline safety laws build upon a solid foundation which seeks to reduce risk and mitigate potential consequences. I mention this because so much of this goes unreported, and these are important facts. That exists and the regulatory environment is set up the way it is to first reduce the risk of an incident, and then if there is an incident, to minimize the potential consequences of that incident. Through conversations like the one we're having today, we can better explore issues that we have in common, including our goals of safely and efficiently delivering energy supplies our nation needs to power the economy. I know all of this sounds great. How many of you are from Mayflower? Okay. Even as good as we try to make transportation systems, whether it is a car, a truck, or, as folks found out in San Francisco, an airplane, things sometimes do occur. The goal is zero accidents, zero releases. And if the goal is to support a 21st century pipeline infrastructure that continues to be the safest form of transportation, then it's important that we not allow the facts to take a back seat. I'd like to go through a few things that I've heard in the recent months, and many of these things are being repeated as fact, sometimes even by reputable media outlets. One of the claims we often hear is that pipeline age, and once they're exposed to the elements, extreme pressure, heat, or viscosity, it's inevitable that they're going to spill. I've heard opponents referring to our pipeline system as ticking time bombs. The phrase ticking time bombs assume a premise that, as a former regulator, I'm not willing to concede. And that argument is something that is imminent because it might possibly be the case. It's a logical fallacy, a disjointed argument. If it were true that pipeline spills are imminent, all the efforts undertaken by the industry, the regulators, the overseers, the law enforcement personnel, and others at the state and national level are absolutely futile. So I reject that viewpoint. I believe, though, oversight matters. And it's one of the reasons why pipelines have the exemplary safety record that they've maintained. Effective oversight by federal and state authorities. Another criticism I hear is that because half of the nation's pipelines are at least 50 years old, and antiquated pipes put the public and the environment at risk. Pipelines aren't actually gallons of milk with expiration dates stamped on them. A correctly installed, well-maintained pipeline can function safely for an indefinite period of time. Inspections are important for determining if problems do exist, and if they do, making sure that changes are made to correct any deficiencies in order to prevent an incident. I've also heard that regulation of the nation's pipeline grid is inadequate, that only a portion of all pipelines are subject to rigorous inspection criteria and regular inspections. I've also heard claims that regulatory rules don't apply to the oldest pipelines and that those are the most likely to spill. While these type of claims may seem expedient, it doesn't make them true. The United States pipeline regulatory system is, I believe, the best in the world. Beginning in the early 1990s, the pipeline safety community embraced a holistic approach to pipeline regulations and oversight to ensure safety throughout the entire operating life cycle of a pipeline. That concept, placed into regulations, is known as the Integrity Management Program and requires the active participation of all stakeholders in constantly examining, testing, reassessing, and monitoring our pipeline system. By utilizing data to drive the decision-making process, the agency reduces risk and mitigates consequences. The product of much debate and at times animated conversation, that principle is sound and has made a significant difference. For at one time, internal and external corrosion was a significant and even the leading cause of pipeline incidents and the leading threat to pipeline integrity. But a significant focus, the constant testing, research, materials upgrade means that corrosion is no longer the leading cause of pipeline incidents. The issue that has emerged today as the leading cause of pipeline ruptures is damage by third parties unrelated to the operation of the pipeline. While I was at the US DOT, I was very pleased to, with a lot of help and arm twisting, to get a national one-call number passed, 811, which replaced the myriad of local and toll-free numbers used all over the country, so that any person, whether you're digging in your backyard or you're a contractor out at the street, simply calls 811, and all utilities, not just pipelines, but all utilities are marked. The war that is currently being fought with pipeline safety has to do with incidental or intentional damage. And believe it or not, there are times when people will hit a pipeline, cover it up, and walk away. After the San Bruno, California pipeline incident in 2010, I called for the creation of a national blue ribbon panel to advocate on behalf of local planning and zoning authorities. And by creating a system and series of best practices, we can educate and inform the public as well as local and state government decision makers on the best way to approach development near pipelines. Simply put, pipelines and people are both better off when they're kept apart. But even with increased development and construction on and around pipelines over the last 10 years, the frequency of pipeline spills and incidents have significantly decreased. Over the last 10 years, spills have decreased by 59%, the number of spills, and spill volume has decreased by 43%. This is welcome news, but if you drive up to Mayflower, we all know that more needs to be done. And since I brought up Mayflower, I'd like to take just a couple minutes talking about that incident. I visited Mayflower yesterday, and I toured the site shortly after the March 29th spill as well. On the positive side, I was pleased to see that so much progress has been made. I walked out into the cove. I was told that my threat was not spilled oil, but venomous snakes. I survived. But I've also looked around, and I'm pleased to see that all but a few of the neighbors have been cleared to return to their homes by both, not only the federal EPA, but also by state environmental overseers as well. What's occurring now, and I'm sure the million-dollar question everybody wants to know, is what's next? And I can tell you that federal regulators are looking through voluminous data to determine exactly what caused that incident and how it can be prevented in the future. Because you see, just like the Asiana 214 crash in San Francisco, the question isn't, do we stop flying airplanes? The question is, what happened? Why? And how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? I believe it's important, therefore, not to rush to judgment. The investigation process is comprehensive and deliberative, and deliberatively slow in order to arrive at a true root cause analysis. If done correctly, will result in lessons learned that can be applied to the future. And that process is not one that can be altered by deadlines, pressures, or other desires. What is known at the time is that the line experienced an upset triggered by a seam crack. What nobody knows is exactly why. I've met through many reports by others seeking to impart their conclusions, most of which seem to center around this particular type of pipe known as ERW pipe. And while transparency is crucial, and I do think records should be released, for transparency is crucial to our open form of government, I nonetheless must caution against non-experts' analysis of this significantly complex issue. The use of the term anomaly, for an example, is a term of art and does not necessarily signify a defective pipe. Similarly, there are many kinds and types of defects, most of which do not actually affect the integrity of the steel or the pipe itself. In sum, caution and restraint should remain the watchwords for now. Finally, I've read that Canadian-derived oil sands crude, or unconventional crude, diluted, known as dilbit or bitumen, eats away at the pipes, and that pipelines are not a safe way to transport heavy crude. That, too, is simply not true. In fact, we've been carrying heavy crudes produced in California, Venezuela, Mexico, and America pipelines for decades. And there have now been at least 4 independent studies, including one commissioned by PHMSA and carried out by the National Academies of Science in response to a congressional mandate. This most recent study found that there is no evidence of causes of pipeline incidents unique to shipments of this type of product, no evidence of chemical or physical properties that are outside the range of other crude oil shipments, no evidence of unique or extreme properties that make these shipments more likely to cause internal corrosion or erosion, and no evidence that these properties will make or cause external corrosion or cracking or cause damage from mechanical forces. I think it's also important to point out that although Pegasus was carrying Canadian crude, it was conventional heavy crude, which is not diluted and mixed with other chemicals. Pipelines operating and maintenance practices are the same for these types of shipments as for other crude oils. The more than 2 million miles of pipelines in the U.S. are a critical component of our economy. As we build more and newer pipelines, all stakeholders, from the government to companies to citizens and zoning boards, must work together to ensure that our infrastructure will not only continue to be the safest, most reliable, and most cost-effective means of transporting these products, but the safety record can improve more. Idealism and activism aside, it's clear to me as a pragmatic observer that fossil fuels will by necessity fuel our economy's path into the future. And pipelines, whether they're in service or yet to be built, will transport the bulk of that energy. That's what makes the discussion surrounding pipeline safety, whether in the form or debate over Keystone XL or examination of the incident at Mayflower, of such vital importance. If this discussion is to be productive, we must ensure that it does not degenerate into an exchange of partisan talking points and rhetoric. Facts must be at the center of the debate, and it's my opinion as the former regulator who has spent the bulk of my career in pursuit of the safest means of transporting products on which our economy runs, that the data, the facts, the science clearly point to the continuing preponderance that pipelines remain our safest form of transportation. Allow me to conclude and then be happy to take your questions by saying I firmly believe that our energy transportation system is sound. All stakeholders cannot, however, rest upon these laurels. In fact, when I was at the department, occasionally I would say, what can we do to improve? And if I was told nothing, and that happened, well, trust me, if you've ever been taken to the woodshed, you'll know what that means. Because all stakeholders cannot rest upon these laurels, including the federal government, and continual improvement in safety can only be made through proactive engagement by regulators and a well-regulated community that is held to the standard that they're required. So I call upon PHMSA to continue to adopt best business practices, to expand research and development into technologies that can detect pipeline deficiencies as well as capabilities to assess pipelines that currently cannot be accessed by smart pig technology. I believe we need greater collaboration among the industry and the government alike to share best practices and lessons learned of granular data, incident prevention, and operational excellence. And I think there needs to be continued safety improvements to integrate the best leak detection technology and programs for a variety of scenarios and conditions. We all have a responsibility, from the regulators who oversee to the operators whose job it is to transport materials we depend upon safely, to the policymakers that have to bring the two together to ensure that improvements of our pipeline infrastructure never stops. And by focusing on this responsibility and by keeping a clear eye on the facts that are before us, we can ensure the continued safe operation of pipelines today and for decades to come. That's a common goal we must all share, and we can accept no less. And that's one I'm confident that we can all achieve. So I'd like to thank you for coming out, and thank you to the Clinton School for having me, and I'd be pleased to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Brigham. All right. We do have time for some questions. If you'll wait till the microphone gets here. If this one's right up here, I'll just give it to you.
You said the Keystone Pipeline is the example of the best safety practices. Well, what's the difference between Keystone and Pegasus, and what's the significance of those differences?
Thank you. So if everybody heard that, the question is, what's the difference between Keystone XL and Pegasus? The Keystone pipeline system, which is currently running, and that's a point I made, the debate on Keystone all involves phase 4 of the Keystone pipeline system. President Bush and President Obama have both permitted the original Keystone project, which runs from Canada now all the way down to Houston. Pipelines that were made back in, say, the 1950s, used a different type of pipe than is used today. The protective coatings that are over the pipe are different. The depth at which the pipe is buried is different. But all pipelines, regardless of their age, are required to be held to the same safety standards. So from the perspective of the inspections, the maintenance, the updates, they're all held to the same standard. What is interesting about TransCanada's commitment on Keystone XL is that they have agreed to measures above and beyond what the federal government requires. They have moved their valve spacing closer together, which means if a pipeline section does suffer a rupture, less oil will leak. They have automated all of their safety valves so that the entire system can be shut down in 15 to 20 minutes. And in a pipeline system, as soon as the pressure is removed from the system, the oil in essence stops moving or substantially slows down. They have agreed to pre-stage a response equipment on site. They've agreed to have additional redundant systems where they talk to the pipeline by both satellite and landline. And I can go on with a few others, but the Keystone XL line, again, is a state-of-the-art flagship. And that's not to say that every pipeline now must be torn apart and rebuilt, because this is something that the operators voluntarily decided to do. They've also increased certain measures for leak detection through environmentally sensitive areas. The current pipeline goes through the Ogallala Aquifer, which is a source of drinking water and irrigation for the entire Midwest, stretching from the Dakotas down to the Panhandle of Texas. They've also agreed to increase patrols and do a few other things.
Mayor?
Thank you. Mr. McCown, thank you very much for being here and helping to educate us even further on this matter. You mentioned a 21st century transportation system for our energy needs, and you mentioned that pipelines, no matter when installed or when constructed, if properly inspected, could last indefinitely. Of course, a lot of us don't know exactly what that means. And I guess my question really is increasingly a concern the community has about the fact that the testing that was done on the Pegasus pipeline previously failed to detect the type of what has now been determined to be flaws in the construction of those particular pipes done in 1947 and 48. So my question is twofold. Number one is, are you satisfied that the existing scientific techniques of trying to inspect and determine whether pipes are properly maintained is adequate enough? And secondly, now that we know that we've got a lot of this pipe that comes through our particular watershed was done at the same time between 1947, 48, 49, how do we determine whether or not a similar situation exists?
Okay. Mr. Mayor, that's a great question. And first of all, let me say that, this type of pipe is prevalent in use everywhere in the country today. There's approximately 50,100 miles of this type of pipe, which seems like a small number when you look at 2.6 million, but it's actually about 40% of our transmission pipeline is this type of pipe. With respect to the tools that are used today, previous to, say, 5 or 10 years ago, the way that pipelines were tested was to do a hydrostatic test, which you're familiar with. Hydrostatic tests are great because you intentionally subject the pipeline to operating pressures beyond its rated capacity in the hopes that something goes wrong. I'm not a big fan of that test, frankly, because it over time can introduce stresses to the pipe that can have other effects. So it is allowable. There's a split in the scientific community on it. This is just Brigham's personal opinion. I don't like subjecting something to what it's not supposed to be subjected to under normal conditions. That's just my personal opinion. The inline inspection tools that have been created to be used in lieu of that are either rely on ultrasonic technology or are of a magnetic flux variety that measures a magnetic field. And those can be very effective at looking at not only circumference, fancy word I can't come up with. What's the word I'm looking for here, guys? Help me out. Circumference cracks. But those same devices can be altered to look for longitudinal cracks, which are the type that is being discussed today. I have not personally analyzed the 2010 or the 2013 data. And even though it's been released, it's still undergoing further analysis. One of the concerns I have with the industry and with PHMSA, frankly, is that as we have made more and more of these tests mandatory, it's taking longer and longer to get them analyzed. Because if anybody wants to go into business, they should create a company with pigs and analysis, because it does take 6 to 9 months to get the data back. And the more sensors we put on one of these internal tools, the more data it gathers, the longer it now takes to analyze. We have to do better. If you have the information, you've got to make it relevant. The concern, of course, is that the pig data runs didn't identify any potential leaks. I'm still waiting for the investigation to come out because I think the jury's still out on that point. The other piece that the jury is still out on is even though there was a seam weld that gave way, we still don't know what actually caused that, and whether or not it was related to the manufacture of the pipeline, the operation of the pipeline, or from some other third party. So until we have those facts, I'm kind of withholding judgment on what really happened.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Abrams, right here. I'll wait for the microphone, Annie.
Thank you. In your hat that you won as transportation cabinet level, air, land, and sea, each one of those modes of transportation has had historic controversy as the evolution has had. How do you recommend that we understand, we the people, the balance between the three that we normally think of, land, sea, and air, and now that dimension of land, which is the pipeline transportation of our energy?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Well, pipelines, they're not new. They've been around for a very long time. In fact, in Baltimore, not too long ago, they dug up a natural gas line, distribution line, and found wood pipe, which was very prevalent back in the late 1800s, early 1900s even. So pipelines have been around for a very long time, starting in Pennsylvania, where oil was discovered, and even moving, believe it or not, liquid whale fat in the very beginning. So but because they're mainly underground, they're out of sight and they're out of mind. The last big debate we had on this issue is when the Trans-Alaska pipeline was put in, and the world was going to end, and it would be death to caribou, and it would destroy the environment. And the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, actually has a very good safety record. But that's been because much was demanded of it, and the regulator stayed on top of it as well. So I think it's a shared responsibility. We've had an issue come up when I was at PHMSA, similar to the Mayflower, where an older pipeline was being used by another pipeline company that transitioned through the Barton Creek aquifer in Austin. And it had leaks in the past and was subject to much debate, in much the same way that I see sort of unveiling in Mayflower. The operator agreed to undertake certain changes. The community was briefed, got an understanding of what the pipeline really does, what the risks really are. The water board and everybody ended off signing off on the line was not moved, by the way, because, it's interesting. We have pipelines through the Everglades, we have pipelines through the marshes, we have pipelines through pristine conditions in Alaska, we have pipelines through aquifers. The federal government laws and regulations require enhanced regulatory oversight and changes when you go into what's either known as the government loves acronyms, so USA, unusually sensitive area, or a high consequence area, depending on the type of the pipeline. And so the law adjusts for that. And what I really liked about Austin was that after coming together, all sides, including the operator, were able to reach an agreement on how to proceed. And that pipeline is, I assume, still in operation today. And I assume it's safe because I've not heard a word about it since. And that's how pipelines are supposed to operate.
Additional questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could comment on the contingency plans that will be put in place with the Pegasus pipeline in the event of earthquakes, and what is done in other earthquake zones for further protection, because we would be up a creek without a paddle if we had an earthquake followed by the loss of our water system.
I can't comment specifically on earthquakes. I have actually looked at the response plans that the pipeline operator has put forward, and I actually find them pretty good. There is a general response plan that's required under the regulations that they've done. They've also done a separate manual for the, and I always get this wrong, is it MOMEL? How do you say that? MOMEL, okay. Watershed area that has dozens, if not, and don't quote me on this, but it's something like 30, 40, or 50 different contingencies. I don't recall whether or not earthquakes was one of those, but I was actually fairly impressed that they had a separate manual for that stretch, which is not required. But I can't comment specifically on earthquakes.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, back to the back, right there. Yeah, stand up. Yes.
Hello, thank you. My name is April Lane. I'm the project director of the Faulkner County Citizens Advisory Group for their bucket brigade. We did some of the air monitoring following the Mayflower rupture. First, I want to address a comment made, and then I'll follow up with a question that I have. You stated that the oil that went through the Pegasus pipeline was conventional and did not have additives added into it. That is incorrect.
Well, all pipelines have additives.
Right.
By conversation meant that it was not, quote, tar sands unconventional oil, which has been portrayed a lot in the media. It was conventional heavy Canadian crude.
Okay,
So,
I just
yes.
wanted to clear that up so that everyone in the audience was aware that there was several hundred different types of chemicals in that particular pipeline that are known to be carcinogenic.
Well, no, I guess I got to take a little bit of issue with that. If you look at, the spill response and have talked to the incident command center and looked, those houses have only been cleared along the route because no carcinogens have been found. But
Today, yes, but in the few weeks after the rupture, our air monitoring shows upwards of 30 chemicals that are very, very harmful to public health. And I'm going to follow that up with my question because I know there's other people here who have questions, but why has PHMSA or any other federal regulatory authority not looked at performing a health assessment in these areas where we've had these massive ruptures? All of the statistics and facts that you've mentioned here today will be impacted by that data, and that science and that data has yet to be collected. And so I'm wondering, why has PHMSA not taken a more proactive role in assisting states who have had an incident like this in collecting that data, which would impact everything we know about these types of incidents?
Well, with respect to the spill volume size, I agree. Any spill is important. Any spill is important to not only that there has been a spill, but to quantify that data. Current spill size for Mayflower is at 5,000 barrels. I believe that spill size number is likely to go down. You can only get to the final spill size number once the line is recharged, because once the line is recharged, you know how much it takes to fill it back up, and then that's where you get the final spill number. But with respect to PHMSA's obligations, PHMSA is two things to maybe explain about PHMSA. Because they're the pipeline safety agency, the primary role for the environmental conditions around it is the EPA, not PHMSA. And so it's the EPA that is responsible for the groundwater testing, for the soil testing, in coordination with the state agency that oversees the environmental aspects of it. The point with respect to the data is that, yes, anyone, for example, in 2005, the pipeline numbers spiked, and you went back and looked at why that was, and it was related to the hurricane. But when you're looking at overall trending in data, the point I was making was that pipeline safety has improved, as have all modes over the years. And when you consider the sheer volume of what's transported, it's a very good safety rating.
Look, I know there are a lot of questions, but I hope you'll come up afterwards to talk to Brigham. We really appreciate you being
Yes,
here.
sir.
This is a very educational program, and I think one that is very timely to Arkansas and to the country. Let's give Brigham a round of applause.